Well, welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome you all here to the Office of University Life's first campus conversation of the year. And there is certainly no shortage of issues to address, and the one we're addressing tonight, Charlottesville, understanding Charlottesville, white nationalism, American society, past, present, and future is among the most important. I also want to welcome those who are watching on the live stream, in addition to those in the room. My name's Suzanne Goldberg. I'm Executive Vice President for University Life here at Columbia. And I thank you for being here and joining us for the conversation. For those of you who are new to Columbia, the Office of University Life focuses on our university as community. We think about university-wide student life issues, community citizenship, and our intellectual life. And all of these things obviously come together in the conversation that we're having tonight. Let me just ask you before we jump in, how many of you here are undergraduates and graduate students and faculty and staff? Great, thanks. And and how many of you are here from the Medical Center campus? I know I saw at least a few of you. So this is what we really try to do here at the Office of University Life, which is bring ourselves together across schools, across students, faculty, and staff. Campus conversations in particular are a chance for us to get together as a university community, to think about, to talk about the pressing issues of our time. I also think of these conversations as an opening and an invitation to more discussion, to talk to, and I ask you and encourage you to think of tonight as that, and ask yourselves as we're talking, how can you continue this conversation outside of here, in your classes, in your communities, and also to share your ideas with us in the Office of University Life. You can always reach us and share those ideas via universitylife@columbia.edu, as well as finding us here afterwards. Please also check out the University Life website. There are many more events, both related to the issues for tonight and also other issues, including climate activism and advocacy and campus speech that will be coming up this fall semester. So before we turn to our panelists, I want to share just a moment. I know everybody is familiar here with what happened in Charlottesville, but just to share a moment of background and refresher, and then also to say a word about format, and then we'll jump in. So as everybody surely knows, Charlottesville, Virginia became the gathering point for a Unite the Right rally in mid-August, actually just about a month ago, to protest the city's planned removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The rally turned out, at least according to the media coverage I read, to be the largest and ultimately most violent gathering of white supremacists in recent US history. We have a couple of historians on the panel, so they will check my facts for me. Many people were injured. One person, Heather Heyer, was killed by a man who came to Charlottesville to join white nationalist groups in the rallies, and he plowed his car, as you probably know, into a large group of counter-demonstrators. Also stunning to many was what happened the night before, when neo-Nazis, KKK members, white nationalists, and supremacists gathered and marched onto the University of Virginia campus bearing torches and entered into violent clashes with students and counter-demonstrators there. And there was and also continues to be significant debate about the comments of our president after that, but right after the violence and repeated since then, when he said, you had one group on one side that was bad, I'm quoting. You had a group on the other side that was also very violent. No one wants to say that. I'll say it right now. That was the president, not me. In the aftermath of the violence in Charlottesville, I shared this out in a post to the university community. It is not every day that white supremacists march on a university campus, torches lighted, chanting, "You will not replace us," and "Jews will not replace us," and brawling with students and others who protested their racist and neo-Nazi and other violent messages. Yet to see the events in Charlottesville as an isolated incident would miss these groups' commitment to spreading their white nationalist views far and wide. Our responsibility as a university community is to face the depth and breadth of this hostility directly, to learn, to think, to come to understand more about our own perspectives and each other's perspectives. And that's certainly what we're hoping to do tonight. Now a few words on format, just briefly. We'll begin with a conversation among our panelists. In about 45 or so minutes, we'll open the conversation to everybody here. I had hoped that we would have a great system of opening it to everybody watching on the live stream, but that will wait for our next technological advancement in the next, hopefully in the next session. And if there are any high-tech people here who volunteer to work with our office, we invite you to do that. And we'll open it up with the understanding that in this area, as with many, there will be more questions than answers. So the idea will be that we'll take a lot of questions and comments and not do a traditional back and forth Q&A. Again, opening the conversation and then turn back to the panelists. And if we have time, we'll do that for 2 rounds. Thank you also to many of you who submitted really thoughtful questions with your registration. All of those have been shared with our panelists. We're hoping to cover many tonight and many more in future conversations. So now to our panelists. Jelani Cobb, first to my left, is the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism on the faculty at Columbia Journalism School. He's a scholar of post-Civil War African American history and 20th century American politics, a staff writer for The New Yorker, and a featured speaker in Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th. And what I meant to say before even beginning the introduction is everybody here is an esteemed scholar and author and speaker. Google them later and learn much more about what they've written and done. Stephanie McCurry, next to Professor Cobb, is Columbia's R. Gordon Hoxie Professor of American History in honor of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and specializes in 19th century United States, the American South, the American Civil War, and the history of women and gender, and also a Pulitzer Prize finalist, among other honors for her book, Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the South. Fredrick Harris, in the middle, is Dean of Social Science on Columbia's Faculty of Arts and Sciences and a Professor of Political Science here, where he also directs the Center on African American Politics, is an acclaimed author and also a recipient of the Lenfest Distinguished Faculty Award. Next to Professor Harris, we have Van Tran. Professor Tran is Assistant Professor of Sociology. He specializes in post-civil rights, post-1965 immigrant communities, and ethnic, racial, and urban inequality in the United States. He is the faculty organizer of the Department of Sociology's Race, Ethnicity, and Migration Workshop, among many other activities, and received the 2017 Graduate Student Advisory Council Faculty Mentoring Award. And at the other end of the panel, next to Professor Tran, is Associate Professor Jeremy Kessler, who's a legal historian and my colleague at Columbia Law School, where he focuses on First Amendment law, administrative law, and constitutional law, and co-directs Columbia University's Politics and Society Workshop, and has served previously as a fellow in presidential studies at the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library. So now I'm going to step over here and into my moderator role, as will share with all of you what I've said to the panelists. I am a vigorous moderator and have invited them each to, and will be sort of throat clearing or whatever as we approach time so that we can keep our conversation lively. So here's the opening question, and it's really for each of you, and we'll just go down the row, which is this, from your perspective as a professor of fill in the blank, how do we understand the conditions that gave rise to what happened in Charlottesville? And how do you think about the politics and the violence and the clash that occurred there? So Professor Cobb, let's turn to you first.
First, I'll say good evening, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm happy that we can have, well, not happy, but I think it's important that we can have this conversation. And I am happy to see so many people invested and interested in this dialogue. Nothing about Charlottesville was surprising or should have been surprising to us in the context in which if we know American history and the kind of cycles of American history. One thing that I'll say that gave me a kind of immediate flashback sense of this was that I covered for The New Yorker, I covered the Dylann Roof trial. And I'd been in South Carolina, I think it was 18 months earlier when the actual shooting happened. I went down afterward and wrote about it. And had probably taken 5 or 6 trips to Charleston in between, those 2 times. And there was one thing about Dylann Roof that, part of him was, the madman, and the part of him was the kind of sage, though I hate to say it in that way, and that he very much understood himself to be besieged and representative of a group of white people who were besieged by black people, by immigrants, by a sort of rising tide of people of color in this country. And that is a very particular and antique fear in American history that has generally generated the same sort of response each time, which is a kind of rising, violent, reactionary, nativist re-entrenchment of white supremacist values. And so when he killed 9 people in the church in July of 2015, he said he did so as a kind of rallying cry for whites to make them wake up and understand that they were under siege. I was not someone, a lot of people thought that he was completely out of his mind to think that people would hear the signal that he was broadcasting and pick up on it in some way. I didn't have that sort of comfort. I thought that he might well have been a harbinger of something. And so when I saw Charlottesville, and many other times prior to Charlottesville, I connected it to exactly what Dylann Roof had said in that courtroom when he was explaining his twisted rationale for the abominable acts he committed. And so I think there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of demographics, in terms of history, in terms of the particular social lineage that led to that moment, which we'll hopefully get to more of in the discussion. But I think those are some of the threads that immediately stood out to me.
Professor McCurry.
Yeah, well, that is exactly the kind of sobering perspective and long-term perspective I think that, historians just unfortunately have about events like this. You're connecting to relatively recent events, but the context is very long and painful. And I think from, speaking as a historian of the 19th century and of the South and slavery and the Civil War and of the Confederacy, unfortunately, the context in which I think about Charlottesville and what troubles me the most is the deep, how deep and constant has been the extent of violence against African Americans in this country, and particularly how much public space and legitimacy has been allowed to white supremacist movements over time in our history. And as a historian of the 19th century, I think immediately about the Confederacy and about the Klan. And that might be a little bit too deep of a history, in which to put these 21st century events, but I think they're very relevant because I see this context, I think, in a 19th century version of what Professor Cobb just said, was that what happened in Charlottesville is a backlash against the violence of Charlottesville, and what the white supremacists mobilizing in Charlottesville is part of a backlash against the challenge to white supremacy that we had seen through a whole variety of social and political movements in the immediate preceding years, especially under the Obama presidency, when there wasn't, for once in American history, a signal given from the top about the space that was going to be allowed for that. And we've seen this repeatedly in this country at very different moments of challenge. When white supremacists are challenged in any way, then you get this violent mobilization and this violent backlash. So, as a historian of the 19th century, I immediately think about the Confederacy. And it's no surprise that, and the pattern goes back to the end of slavery. There's nothing accidental about the symbols of white supremacists. There's a reason why they carry Confederate flags and why they mobilize around Confederate statues. They're there to rally the troops. And what you have to understand about Confederate statues and every other symbol of the Confederacy is that's what they're there for. They are there to rally the troops, to fly the flag of white supremacy. The Confederacy, in ways that people are only beginning to say as bluntly as it needs to be said, is the key symbol of white supremacy because that was the only raison d'etre of that nation. The critique of the Union, the ambitions of it as an independent nation. The only stated purpose was to make slavery as a status for black people permanent into the indefinite future. It was the fact that slavery was threatened that made the Confederacy a necessity to secessionists and to white Southerners in the 19th century. But one weird point that I want to make is that it's really important that the Confederacy was defeated. They're a weird choice for Trump because they were defeated. And it was only then that they were able to turn into a symbol of this romantic South. The Confederacy was a deeply reviled and unpopular regime for the people who lived under it. It was only when it was defeated and it was no longer making demands on its citizens could it be seen as a symbol of a united South. And what happened in Reconstruction is that in the late 1860s and 1870s, that's the moment that white supremacists began to rally around the Confederacy as the symbol of their movement. They couldn't do it when it was a real thing, taxing them, conscripting their sons, et cetera, et cetera. And so it became available as a symbol when it was no longer a real government, a real regime. And it's in this context that the violent backlash comes, because it's when that one moment, like one recently, when Reconstruction, when African Americans were finally free, when black men finally had some political rights, when they were able to enter the public sphere and make claims on it about what justice is, that there was the Klan. There's the backlash of the Klan exactly at that moment. So it feels like a very familiar pattern and a very deep-seated one in American history, and in that sense goes back, I think, in ways that Americans just still don't really understand just how violent the Klan was and what a bloodbath that was. And the only reason that they were put down in the 1870s is the federal government did not tolerate it at that moment.
Thanks. Dean Harris.
Right. So I hope this is not too much of an echo. I'm a political scientist, which means that I should not study political behavior before the Second World War, because people didn't count things before that time. But in reality, as a political scientist whose work is imbued with history, and I do work on African American political history, you really have to look at the Reconstruction period to figure out, to make sense of what's going on now. And so I'm going to echo a little bit, but also expand on what's been already said. Reconstruction is this pivotal moment of the fall of Reconstruction. There is a wonderful book I read years ago by Howard University historian, late Rayford W. Logan.
That's right.
A book called The Betrayal of the Negro, where he documents sort of what happens with the erosion of African American political rights by the turn of the 20th century. And not just sort of on the ideological side, what's happening in sort of the stereotypes and a demonization of black people, the marginalization of black people, but the outright violence that occurs during this period with the rise of the Klan. And so part of what I want to get you to think about is this dance, this tempo of one step forward, two steps back. So in my mind, there are three periods. Reconstruction, we've heard part of that. By mid-20th century, where you see the expansion of African American political rights with the rise of the civil rights movement. The 1950s, Montgomery bus boycott. You have major legislative victories, although there's violence that occurs. But also, as you know, with the Confederate monuments, the 1950s, it rises again. State flags, in my own home state of Georgia, puts on a Confederate flag is put on to the state flag as a symbol of resistance. And this occurs elsewhere as well. And so what you have is this legislative victories with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, fair housing, other successes that come out of the Lyndon Baines Johnson's administration with the push of the civil rights movement. And then something turns by 1968. Nixon, right? The rise of George Wallace. So we had the second Reconstruction as Rayford W. Logan was writing about when he wrote about the betrayal of the Negro. And by the 1970s, things began to change. You hear Nixon talking about the importance of law and order. You see the rise of American conservatism that leads to Reagan, to Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, starts his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is the site of the death of 3 civil rights workers, right? And so here we are in the Obama, post-Obama era, where we had a huge leap forward with the election of an African-American, a person of African descent as president in the United States. And here we are dealing with another native, as Rayford W. Logan talked about in his book on the betrayal of the Negro. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Professor Tran.
Well, dear friends, let me begin by saying I'm delighted to be here among all of you and also among my colleagues. I'm a sociologist of immigration, so my comments will focus on the role of immigration in shaping the rise of white nationalism and also what led to Charlottesville, as we saw. I'll try to kind of focus my comments on 2 separate but related threats. And the first is really the sense of demographic threat that immigration has posed to the American society. The second one is a sense of cultural/economic threat. So to begin with the demographic side of things, we all know about the browning of American society. The stats are familiar to most of you. Since 1965, we have received, on average, 1 million immigrants per year into our country. And as of today, the foreign-born population is about 1/8 of the total U.S. population. If you add their children who are the U.S.-born or children of immigrants, we have another 8. So 1 in 4 Americans is of immigrant descent. And we see this in our community in New York City, but also in places that until recently have not received any immigration at all. So historically, immigration is a highly concentrated phenomenon. Immigrants arrive in a handful of states, mostly blue state, but over the last 20 years or so, immigration has truly become a national phenomenon whereby small towns in Georgia and Ohio and Iowa and rural areas in Pennsylvania are seeing for the very first time the presence of immigrants from every single background. Now, in contrast, 100 years ago, immigrants arrived were mostly European. Immigrants today are mostly non-white by our racial classification. So what we are feeling in New York and the sense of comfort we have with cultural and social differences is not the case in many of these newer communities where a lot of the established population is grappling with the arrival of immigrants in their midst. And this is really creating a sense of demographic threat for that population. Now, when you look at the geography of polarization in our country, something puzzling is happening right now, which is by own prediction, you would expect, right, that places with high proportion of immigrants, like New York and LA, would be more likely to be anti-immigration. But the voting pattern is the exact opposite. LA, New York, California, Boston, Philly, all voted decisively against our current president. And it's exactly the places that had very few to zero presence of immigration that was actually voting in support of Trump. So this is puzzling because you would expect that with no contact, people would be more likely to feel a sense of threat. And that's often much more on the perceived side of threat and not actual threat. And that, I think, is really something that we have to unpack a bit more. On the economic side of things, I think what's happening is the kind of, the sense that immigrants and minorities are cutting in line, that they're not waiting their turn, and they're being given more than their fair share. And this is a myth, not a reality, and we can come back to this in the Q&A. But what's really happening is a lot of working class white men, both the older and the younger generation, are feeling a sense of loss and despair and displacement from the status that they once used to feel a sense of entitlement to because of the rise in the social mobility of the non-white population. And this is true, once again, because mobility is often a zero-sum process in the American society. There are only so many slots in the college admission process. There's only so much resources to go around, and this is really an interesting element to this debate. So I think between the demographic and the cultural side of the debate, I think we're seeing that people are reacting rather negatively to the presence of differences. And one question then is, how do we unpack, what we should do to move forward in a more inclusive way?
Thanks so much. Professor Kessler.
Thanks. I first wanted to echo previous commenters and thanking you all for being here. I'm very excited and honored to participate in the conversation. I also wanted to echo several of the previous speakers Professor Cobb began his comments by saying there's nothing surprising about Charlottesville, and I think that's a really important point to emphasize, and the long histories that we've just heard about the many elements of racial politics in the United States stretching back centuries, the way in which that longer history led up to Charlottesville. I endorse that long historical vision of seeing Charlottesville as the not the culmination even, but the continuation of a very long process of white supremacy and a particular kind of race politics in America. But as a legal historian of civil liberties in particular, I thought what I might do, just to kick things off, is focus on a shorter history that I also think plays a part of that longer history and contributed in very specific ways to what happened at Charlottesville. And that is the history of the rise of modern, what you might call modern First Amendment ideology. So this history begins in the mid-century, in the 30s and 40s, but then really takes off after World War II. And by the late 60s, you have developed what remains the reigning ideology of the First Amendment and civil liberties in this country, which is associated with the idea that everyone, quote unquote, everyone, has a right to speak, regardless of the noxiousness of their views. This commitment was central to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union's, increasing mainstream relevance after World War II. The ACLU started out as a very marginal organization that was almost exclusively committed to defending what were seen as left-wing radicals, including immigrants, labor organizers, civil rights organizers, and so forth. But on the other side, starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the ACLU and other civil libertarian organizations really take up this idea that what the First Amendment and civil liberties means is this neutral defense of all speakers, that all speakers have an equal right to be heard. This ideology was articulated very powerfully in a series of cases litigated by the ACLU, specifically defending the rights of Klansmen and neo-Nazis to speak. Those were the great ACLU victories that were considered the kind of the culmination of this commitment to First Amendment neutrality, to this liberal vision that all speakers have a right and should be encouraged to engage in the public sphere. That First Amendment ideology, so it's only about 50 years old, 60 years old, then was, I think, provided the crucial background to a much more recent discourse about campus speech and about anxieties both on campus and off campus that a lot of young people especially had become committed to the idea of shutting down bigoted, racist, sexist speech. This anxiety that this generation, or the last couple of generations, were increasingly no longer committed to that great First Amendment ideology that originates in the mid-century, and were platforming speakers, protesting commencement speeches, and so on and so forth. So both the First Amendment ideology of the mid-century, and then as it shaped the debate around campus speech and around these issues of whether young folks on the left or committed to ideals like racial equality had gone off the right path and calling for the silencing or the exclusion of certain views on and off campus. And then finally, the last legal development, which occurs in the last 50 years that we see in Charlottesville, is the creation of an individual right to bear arms. And I would say one way of understanding Charlottesville from the legal point of view is we see the sort of convergence of these three legal developments, and we can understand that I think all three of those legal developments, the development of First Amendment ideology, the critique in its name of largely left-wing campus groups and young people, young protesters more generally, and finally the individual right to bear arms, that all three of those legal developments or legal conversations have a particular racial valence and have long had such a valence, and we saw them really come together in Charlottesville.
So, thank you. It's challenging after listening to all of you, including the unintentional grouping of a lot of historians here, although I guess it's not surprising in some ways that historical expertise would be essential to understanding where we are today. It's tempting to go immediately to the question of, the picture seems pretty bleak in terms of avoiding the kind of repetition that each of you in various ways has talked about. But I'm not going to go there yet, and I will leave that to others in the, to ask. But I've also given our speakers, I'm going to pose a question to each of them now, and I've given them permission to head in a different direction if they'd rather not talk about what I've raised and talk about something else. But I guess, Dean Harris, can I go back to you first on, and here's really the question, and I'm going to try to tap into your political science side, or at least the political side, if not the scientific side, which is the question, what is it about our political structures, both then and in the evolution toward now, that sort of facilitates and sustains the endurance of the conflicts that we saw, not only of racial conflict, but the range of conflicts that we have seen in Charlottesville, to the point where I think, based on what everybody has said, we can imagine repetition over time. Is there anything structural that you would point to that either that reinforces this now, or that we might think about even changing?
I mean, that's a huge question, and it requires also going back in history, although I will try not to. But one thing I immediately think of is federalism, right? The idea of states' rights, and that's meant different things at different historical moments. And so part of the challenge is the way that our political system is structured, particularly around when we think of presidential elections and the sweepstakes that involve, with electoral votes and where they're concentrated. If you were to overlay sort of the regime of white supremacy that was dominated by the Southern Democrats for much of half of the 20th century, just flip that over to the Republican Party, it's essentially almost the same map, right? And so, part of it is sort of electoral rules, but it also has to do with something that we don't talk enough about it in our political culture, and that's political ideology, and how sort of conservative ideology, whether it's from the Republican Party, a Democratic Party, when it comes to the rights of the other, those that are perceived to be the other, there seems to be an abandonment of one party of those rights and aligned with another party in this two-party system, right? So there's the party of civil rights, the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, right? That abandoned politically African Americans by the turn of the 20th century. And so over time, you see with this, what political scientists call partisan realignment, by the 1930s, things change. But again, we sort of keep being trapped in this history, and I do think there's some underlying currents in our electoral system that helps to sustain that, right? But I think there's hope. And it's something that Van has mentioned about demographic change. Sort of the magic number, in a sense, is 2044, when demographers talk about...
That sounds kind of far away, just,
well, you know,
but maybe not in the history of our country.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
in the scope of, I guess,
absolutely.
since Reconstruction, and maybe it's not as far as, but I think we're pushing in that direction. We're talking about these sort of states like California, right, which is a very diverse state, and you're going to see changes in big states like Texas, which is key. And again, sort of learning from history, one of the things that pushed along reform in civil rights was the fact that African Americans who left the rural South and went to cities like Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York changed the outcome of presidential elections. And so that demographic change that Van talked about will likely move things, I think, forward. But so we could talk more about that, but that may have some upsides and some downsides as well.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
On the downside part of it, in case you were harboring a glimmering, fickle, frail flame of hope.
I'm trying to, yeah.
You know, allow me to extinguish that. Well, because I think there's another part of this. You know, one is that going back to South Carolina, when they took down the Confederate flag, notably Nikki Haley, then Governor Nikki Haley, oversaw the removal of the Confederate flag. And people saw this as a kind of great moment. Now, if you looked around the State House, the grounds there, you would see that the Confederate flag was probably the least of the concerns there. There's a monument to Governor Ben Tillman, who bragged about the fact that he'd led lynching parties. He's still there. J. Marion Sims. Pitchfork Ben, right. J. Marion Sims, the trailblazing physician who pioneered practices of gynecology on unwilling enslaved black women, memorialized there. Just for the record, he's also memorialized at Central Park. You could take a walk down and see the monument to him there as well. He's memorialized there. But the element of the most concern is that on the steps of the State House is a monument to George Washington. Now this looks innocuous unless you know why that monument to George Washington is there. That monument was there not simply as a reference to the Revolutionary War, but it was a reference to the idea of the belief that the Confederacy was furthering the ideals of the American Revolution. Which is to say, they looked at George Washington, and not without good reason, saw someone who said that the Negroes were never meant to be enshrined in American democracy. And you could go back to Jefferson, who said that he did not think it was possible for black people to ever coexist with white people in this country. Abraham Lincoln said the same thing, is the part of the Emancipation Proclamation. The other part of the Emancipation Proclamation was a plan to deport all the black people after they were freed. Note, he never came up with a plan to deport the Confederates who were trying to and ultimately did assassinate him, but was attempting to deport the black people who were fighting to save that union. Fast forward to the 21st century. That question of whether or not American democracy was ever conceived to be multi-ethnic, to include the populations that we see now, has not died. And that is why we have the Millers and the Bannons and the Gorkas and the so-called populism that they've attracted to Donald Trump. Now, as a final point about the demographics, South Carolina, again, is instructive, and Mississippi, which were notorious adherents to the codes of white supremacy, largely because these were the two states in which there were actual black majorities. And it was recognized that, for as racially paranoid and negrophobic as the average white Southerner was, those who lived in areas in which they were outnumbered by black people were that much more. And so, in some way, the reactionary movements that we have seen are very much a product of this conception that there are more people, as Professor Tran has pointed out, there are more people coming in who don't look like what you think of your conception of Americans. Donald Trump, a native of Queens, as I am, Queens went in his lifetime from being the whitest borough of New York City to being literally, statistically, the most diverse county in the entire United States. And for a segment of the white population that experienced that, they have never gotten over it. And is a microcosm of what we might see as a broader social dynamic in 2044.
Yeah.
Could I just say one little thing about this? And maybe it is to try to keep this flame burning down very, very low. It doesn't have to do with intention.
We can see the glass half empty and half full.
It doesn't have to do with intention. I know way too much about the history of South Carolina to disagree with a single thing you've said. It's way more than statutes. It's way more than flags. I mean, it's a historical landscape that we all walk on every day, and we don't even know half the time what it is that we're walking amongst. But it has to do with power, because South Carolina is really interesting in the way Professor Cobb was suggesting. Because in those places where African Americans were the majority of the population, the Klan never got sparked to life. It was never possible. So I think one of the lessons that I take away from this is if we're thinking about white people's intentions, then we're in serious trouble. But what we also have to think about is what we permit, what we allow. And what happened in South Carolina and why the Klan never got off the ground is that the governor armed black men. He wasn't too afraid to do that. He said, they're now citizens, they're Republicans, they're members and supporters of the Republican Party, they're the loyal citizens in this republic, and he armed them. And so that didn't last long, but it did put paid to the Klan in that place. So one of the things that I'm thinking about in 2017 is what we will allow, what we will permit. You said one step forward, two steps back. I don't think we're in the same place as 1867. I don't think we're in the same place as 1968. But we've got to make sure that we're in a better place, and that this has to do with what citizens allow and what their government allows. It's very frightening to have a president like this at this particular moment because of the permissions that can be given. But I just want to say that it's about power.
Yeah, the
So
conditions are not the same.
Hop over to that side of the
Okay.
panel but I did have one just specific question actually for you, Professor McCurry, since you were, used just a small piece of your allocated time here, which is somebody wrote in a question, a native Charlottesvillian, and asked, well, why here, right? Why here in 2017? So if you could just say a word or two about that before I turn to Professor Tran with the question.
Well, I haven't seen anything specific about why the Unite the Right picked Charlottesville. Why they would pick a Robert E. Lee statue makes sense. They think that's the defensible statue. It's not, but they think that. But it is Mr. Jefferson's university. It is Mr. Jefferson's town, and in that sense, I think it's a fitting place for this struggle to be played out. I suspect that has a great deal to do with it, that there's no place more associated with Jefferson than Charlottesville. So besides that, why they picked that statue in that place, I really don't have any particular insight to that.
Richard Spencer is also an alum, if I recall correctly.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's something symbolic about going to Charlottesville for sure, and and then putting. It's a place with a lot of students, which goes to Jeremy's point. So, there's something there to inflame. And I think you got to go where you can inflame if you're provocateurs. And if you see the video, they go in battle gear and armed. So the idea of an equivalence is ridiculous. Anybody who's seen that news coverage knows that.
So, Professor Tran, your insights into our polarized, changing demographic are important to this conversation and to the question of whether the flame is being extinguished or a little, flickering at least
The
a little.
embers.
Right, exactly. But jump in as you like.
I just want to add kind of 2 footnotes to what has been said before. And the first is really the census projection published in 2012, that by 2043, the United States will become a majority-minority country in which the non-Hispanic white population will become a minority of the total population. And that projection, by the way, is inaccurate. And I'll say a word about that in a second, but that projection really heightened the sense of demographic transition that we have all been talking about. And that projection is inaccurate because the Census Bureau lumps together people who have one white and one non-white parent, which are increasingly many of our students at Columbia now, and count them as non-white. Even though, depending on the exact phenotypes and the surname of the father versus the mother, the gender-specific pairing of the non-white and the white partner, the student or the offspring can look phenotypically white and in own intent and purposes live their life almost as a non-Hispanic white person. So my colleague Richard Albert at the Graduate Center has recalculated this and showed that actually that number really is not what it's meant to be. And if you were to lump the offsprings of such pairing and count them as white, then it will be 2060 or something when the US becomes a majority-minority country. The second footnote is really to the question of Charlottesville, why here, why us? And obviously Richard Spence, who is the leader figure of the Own Right movement, is an alum of UVA, also was a dropout doctoral student at Duke prior to running the National Policy Institute, which is really the mouthpiece, if you will, for that entire movement. And I have been reading a lot of Reddit threads, by the way. This is where they're hanging out and hiding in anonymity on the internet. And they said specifically that they were planning this in this particular college town because UVA would be a place with enough white liberal elite and professionals who are more progressive, such that the protest and the counter-protest would not be seen entirely in racial terms, which is to say if you have the alt-right movement protesters who are basically all white, and the counter-protester being on black and minority, then it will become much more racially explicit. And instead, they're trying to frame it as the loss of the white identity and not explicitly racial, even though I think most of us here would agree that there's nothing that is not explicitly racial about the white supremacist movement here at all. One final footnote to this has to do with the construction of whiteness as a category, and I find this fascinating. And this comes back to Professor Goldberg's opening statement about Jews will not replace us. Mm-hmm. This is fascinating because Jews have always been counted by the census as white, non-Hispanic white, at least for the last 50 years now. So it is not just about, white national identity or white nationalism. There's an element in this entire movement that has direct implication and connection to the neo-Nazi movement. And let's be clear about that. And that is important for us to keep in mind because the distinction between white nationalists, white supremacists, and neo-Nazis are sort of fuzzy on the edges. They're one and the same, but also the neo-Nazi, I would argue, is the most extreme version of these three categories. And I think what we saw there was actually quite unfortunate.
So that actually gets me to a question that I'm hoping Professor Kessler can enlighten us about. And before I turn to him, I want to remind you that After this, we're going to turn to you, and just to give you the heads up that I'll repeat in a moment, but I find in teaching if we repeat things twice, they stand a greater chance of getting heard, which is that we'll ask you to say your name and your school, if you're associated with the school, and then a question or comment, and just a reminder in advance to keep it brief so that we can get a number of different people weighing in. Professor Kessler, we've talked about this just in the hallways of the law school. What were the neo-Nazis doing in Charlottesville? And can you help us connect what happened there, just even briefly, to what's happened where neo-Nazis and the alt-right are in other parts of the world, Europe or beyond?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to say is that there have always been, since the emergence of fascism in the interwar period in Europe initially, there were American fascists. So there were American fascists and American Nazi affiliates back in the 30s, and those groups were pretty clearly, in most instances, a continuation, and particularly in many areas in the Midwest and the North and the West, an expansion of the Klan, the second generation of the Klan, of the Jim Crow Klan and the Klan of the early 20th century. So on the one hand, there is a really an autochthonous American history linking the Klan to fascism and to Nazism. Then the second issue is the neo-Nazis. Where do neo-Nazis come from, right? Because back in the 30s, they didn't call themselves neo-Nazis, they called themselves Nazis. So neo-Nazism, also like fascism, originates in Europe. It obviously originates after World War II and really intensifies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, partly in response to immigration, to some of the demographic logics that other speakers have already addressed. And in that form, what you have is a recapitulation, and in some ways I think a kind of like a simplification of the complex initial site and nature of fascism. So neo-Nazism really sort of boils it down to a commitment to the purification of a given society, of all others that are considered not the true creators and inheritors of that society. So it can be defined nationally, and it often is, but it could also be defined globally, and it has been at times. So the purification of a given society, and what I would say a cult of violence. So a purification of that society through violence, and a commitment not only to the idea that violence is the appropriate means of purifying the society, but that there is something ennobling about the engagement in that violence. And so this is particularly in the post-World War II Europe. You had in many countries this idea of a kind of a post-war, a post-military society, that Europe would, after the horrors of World War II, be committed to peace. And so what neo-Nazis impart in embracing this cult of violence, I think we're suggesting that they would overcome that softening of European culture, that abandonment, allegedly, of martial culture, and would re-embrace the proper European excellence when it comes to violence. So violence and purification of society, and then that spreads from really Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, to other areas of Europe and to the United States. And we could say more about the role of neo-Nazis in particular and anti-fascists in response to any questions that might arise about it.
Great, thank you. So I think we've put a lot of ideas on the table for consideration and now invite you to hold up your hands, and we have colleagues from the Office of University Life who will be bringing mics to you. And again, I just want to underscore that we'd like to get as many comments or questions in as quickly as possible. So your name, your school, and your quick question or comment, and then we'll keep the mics bouncing around for a couple of minutes, and we'll come back to the panel. The last caveat I have for you is, again, just keep in mind, as I said at the beginning, this is the opening of a conversation. We'll be talking about these issues throughout the year. And there are, as we've heard already, so many more questions than there are definitive answers. So it's in that spirit that I invite your questions now. So why don't you start us off, your name, your school, and your brief question or comment.
All right. My name is Willem Morris. I'm from Columbia College. So my question is that after Charlottesville, you saw a lot of like news outlets and just people on Twitter and Facebook kind of like self-congratulatorily like condemning this instance. And like there are so many people out there who were kind of quiet on other like more less intense white nationalism or racist issues. And these are the same kind of people who can be maybe resistant to sending their kids to schools with like African Americans, or resistant to urban housing projects like for minorities to where they live. So do you think there's kind of a concern that people associate this sort of white nationalism with racism and think that if I'm not, I'm not out there marching with pitchforks, my friends are marching out with pitchforks, so I'm not racist and my friends aren't racist, so that maybe this kind of racism isn't actually a problem where I live?
It's hard to see. Oh, go ahead. Yes.
Hi, my name is Yosan Alamu, and I'm a first year in CC. And my question was in regards to white nationalism and American society, and how you guys talked about how the events that led up to Charlottesville have been a continuation of the white supremacist ideals that have existed in this country. How does Columbia play part into this conversation? Because there are statues here of white supremacists, like that of Thomas Jefferson, and that names like George Washington have been immortalized in this institution. And how does Columbia play part in this conversation? How are we as an institution going to condemn white supremacy while we're still complicit in it?
I see a couple more hands.
There's someone right here with a mic.
Hi, I'm Nora. I'm a freshman in CC also. I had a question about what you're talking about with the Second Amendment, sort of the changing nature of free speech. So I know in Charlottesville, it was an open carry state. There was a lot of intimidation, people holding automatic rifles in front of synagogues, frightening protesters, et cetera. So do you think, I know the ACLU, I don't know all the facts, but has slightly changed their stance on this, and that there's sort of a general consensus that maybe free speech has changed. So I just wanted to know more about that and how you think gun laws will continue to play out, and I'm sure whether there will be more clashes in front of monuments or just in general.
Thank you. And I see some hands in the back, too. Okay. Oh, great.
Hi,
Go ahead.
hi, I'm Martin, and I'm from Graduate School of Journalism. And my question is about the statues, the Confederate statues, and the controversy surrounding it. My question is what should be done with those statues? Where should should the American people keep those statues? Where should they be kept? And I want to know also your opinion on the controversy about the statues of Christopher Columbus, and maybe the name of Columbus, like Columbus Circle, Columbia, yeah.
Great. Thanks. Do you have it? Okay.
Hi. This question is basically for...
Just your name again and your
sorry.
school.
My name is Matthew Linder. I'm from Columbia College. This question is basically just for Professor Cobb. Why do you feel that we shouldn't be hopeful about the future when we actually, in regards to demographic change, when we actually see people in highly diverse areas being more positive and accepting in regards to people of color? Why should we expect a bigger reactionary response when we actually see that when people are surrounded by people who are different than they are, they tend to have more positive views about diversity?
Great. You know what we'll do is we'll actually take several more questions or comments, because I think in keeping with our timing, then I'll turn them over to the panelists, and people will wind up with a couple of minutes to react.
Hi, right here.
Okay.
My name is Kair Joy. I'm a first-year graduate student at the School of International and Public Affairs, and I'm also an incoming diplomat with the U.S. State Department. My question is, I often get from a lot of other diplomats from other countries, what makes white nationalism in America different from specifically white nationalism in Europe? I also get a lot of questions from Americans that, well, I honestly think these questions are kind of naive, but people will say that, you know, Germany, for instance, they put down their neo-Nazism, at least on a federal level. Why doesn't America do the same? So it's kind of two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Does somebody else have a mic in hand? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jordan. I'm a first year at CC. And I don't know if this is true, but I saw an article that Columbia University College Republicans had actually invited one or two white nationalists to speak at Columbia this fall, and I just wanted to know your opinions and feelings on that.
Thanks. And for people who are not familiar with the acronyms of CC, for example, it's Columbia College. Go ahead, who's got the mic? Great.
Hi, my name's Chelsea. I'm a grad student at SIPA.
SIPA is the
School of International and Public Affairs. So my family is from the South in Virginia, and my disclaimer is that I didn't grow up with them. But I have gotten to know them over the years, and they're from a really poor section in Southern Virginia. And my sister, who's 19, actually wears the Confederate flag. She has a poster in her room. She has a really strong Southern identity that we talk about. And so I'm thinking that there's a whole space of not white supremacists, but not super liberal social activists that we're not talking about that are contributing to white supremacy. So I'm wondering, would you attribute this to an education problem in the American school system where students or youth are not being taught the proper history that is actually leveraging these events? So what's your opinion on the education role?
Great. And is there, are we all set for now?
There's one more question down here.
Sure. And then I will turn it over to...
Yes, Ufa Jimenez, CC. Just in reference to the question about statues at Columbia, at the WikiCU website, which is a website that was created to be a Wikipedia for Columbia University, you can actually see that Nicholas Murray Butler, who was president of Columbia College and who the library is named after, actually endorsed fascists. So I think I just want, in reference to that question, just want to put that additional context in that our library might also be suspect in that conversation about whether we're still complicit.
Great. So thank you very much. You've put a tremendously important array of issues on the table, and I know that if we just passed the mic down the rows and each person weighed in, there would be even more. And I'm not going to repeat, but I just want to draw out a couple of themes, which is how do we understand, the complex nature of our society in which some people may see a neat divide between racists and non-racists, and others may see more of a spectrum of opinion. How do we think about the role of institutions like Columbia and cities like New York and around the country in terms of responding to the statues, the names on buildings, their own institutional history? How do we think about, is there a possibility for change when we see sort of this, that there is, that people are, there's movement. There's a lot of anti-racist work that goes on in the world. It's making some dents in some places. And then questions about how do we think about speakers who come to campuses and elsewhere and profess the sorts of racist views and fascist or neo-Nazi or white supremacist views that we've heard, and what, if anything, to what extent is white nationalism in the U.S. distinct? So we have, you each get about 3 minutes to sort it out for us. But really, again, I just want to underscore as I turn it over to our colleagues here that, and maybe we'll go in reverse order. So, Jeremy, if you don't mind starting, that this is an opening conversation for the academic year. We will gather often in large and small groups to continue these conversations. So, Professor Kessler.
Thanks. Thank you all so much for your questions. I'll just try to hit a few of them. First on the question of the where is free speech culture, or First Amendment culture going after Charlottesville? Nora referenced the ACLU did change its stance immediately after Charlottesville, announcing that they would no longer represent groups that wanted to engage in public protest, permitted protest, that also wanted to avail themselves of their state's open carry laws. That the ACLU would no longer, as they did in Charlottesville, represent groups that both wanted to publicly assemble and to do so while brandishing assault rifles. So that I do think is a positive development. That said, I was very struck by, other than that ACLU policy change, how quickly the discourse around Charlottesville changed after about 72 hours. In the wake of the death of the IWW organizer, Heather Heyer, at Charlottesville, and counter-protesters like Cornel West saying things like, if it hadn't been for the Antifa activists who were there basically pushing back against the white supremacists engaging in the protest, I would have been killed. So there was this moment where people were very upset about the violence they saw at Charlottesville, and there was actually an opening, an interest in this idea of, if these people are going to be this extreme, if white supremacists are going to be this extreme and this violent, then maybe we should be comfortable with more direct measures, sort of excluding them from the public sphere and suppressing them. That went away pretty quickly. I think the discourse evened out back to, the mainstream media discourse went back to saying, well, everyone has a right to speak. I know I'm at, 1 minute remaining. On the question of, so something changed, but I don't think very much. On the question of the difference between white nationalism in the United States versus elsewhere, in particular in Europe, I think the key difference has been addressed at some length, which is the legacy of settler colonialism and slavery that is intrinsic to American history, and the long historical unfolding of those constitutive elements of American society makes white nationalism in America distinct. On the other hand, I would say that I think there is a sense, at least in the United States and on many American campuses, there is a sense that I think Europe is a lot less vulnerable to white nationalism than it is. The European Union, I'll cut off in a second. The European Union, for instance, on the one hand, is a post-national project, so how could it be a white national project? But European identity is still largely defined by whiteness, and so there's a lot of you might not call it white nationalism, but there's a lot of white supremacy still going on in Europe.
Thank you. And what I will do is just a little gentle tap when you have about 30 seconds left, if that's okay. Thanks very much.
I'll
Professor
take the
Tran.
question on race, because on racism, because it's bread and butter of sociology. And I want to make the distinction between what we call interpersonal racism and institutional racism. So a lot of my students would say, well, I have black friends and Asian friends and Hispanic friends. I'm not racist. And in fact, you are not racist because, first of all, you're a Columbia undergrad. You can't be racist. But more importantly, you have friends and people in your lives that are different from you. But what we often forget is that racism runs so deep to the core of our psyche as a society, going way back to the historical legacy of slavery, that many of the institutional practices are still in place. From segregated neighborhoods, low quality schools, disproportionate sentencing for blacks and Latinos, the list go on, and all of you are probably familiar with them at this point. So here's an intellectual exercise I want all of you to do with me, which is imagine after this conversation, we go home and all of us act in a non-racist manner to everyone for the rest of our life, which arguably is the most idealistic outcome we could ever hope for, right? That we'll have an equal society. And even under that ideal scenario, the differences, inequality that exists right now in terms of wealth and income and education and the types of neighborhoods and schools that people go to and live in, shall be reproduced across generations such that black-white inequality, to take the most extreme version, shall be replicated unless there's some way in which we can interrupt that process of intergenerational reproduction of privilege. And that is really a conundrum that all of us are struggling with. Affirmative action policy is one example of what we're trying to do to redress that black-white inequity. But really, when you think about your individual self-interest and group-level interest and group-level inequality, is it fair for me to ask you to give up your admission slot so that another student from a less privileged background get into Columbia College? How do we think about that holistically without being antagonistic against each other? There are no easy answers to the question that you raise and to the question of what can we do as a community. But the first moment that I think we should all engage in is really a moment of understanding and appreciation. Because when you have understanding of that structural inequality, you're much more likely to think above and beyond self-interest, which is really extremely idealistic, and I know it's hard for me to ask all of you to do because you have your entire future ahead of you. You want to be successful, and we want you to be successful. So it's really something to think about, but I think if we work together with goodwill over time and looking forward, we can find the ways in which everyone will be given a fair share of the opportunity in our country and hopefully for the rest of the world as well, because there's another piece of that, which is structural inequality at the global level. The country where you're born into determines pretty much everything in terms of an education that you will or will not get. And I came from Vietnam, so I'm deeply cognizant of that inequality.
Thank you. Dean Harris.
Yes, I'm going to sort of try to tackle the question about what to do with the monuments. What do we do about these images of our past? And one thing I want to do is to try to make a distinction between history and memory. And part of this is autobiographical. As I mentioned before, I grew up in Georgia. I grew up around elders whose parents were slaves, right? This is a part of my sort of socialization as a kid growing up in Georgia. I had heard stories about lynchings. And I grew up not far from this place called Stone Mountain, which is the Mount Rushmore of the Confederacy. And I remember as a kid, every Labor Day, the Klan would have a rally on the top of Stone Mountain. And I was still, despite all that, I'm still ambivalent about what could be viewed as erasure of these monuments, because in many ways, I think they are important signposts of where we've come from and what we're still grappling with. I don't necessarily think they should be in a public square. I think perhaps they should be in a museum. And also there's still this ambiguity. I mean, maybe Jelani can talk about this, but there's this guy by the name of Otis Howard, Howard University is named for, right? He was a general during the Civil War. And he was a part of the Freedmen's Bank Bureau. Very sort of lauded within black communities in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Howard University is a very important institution. But General Howard was also involved in the Indian Wars. That's right. Right? He was a part of the Native American genocide. Mm-hmm. What do we do with that tension? Right? And so what I want to do is to sort of think about this issue of memory, history, and the ambiguities of what we should think about in terms of removing these statues.
I'll just note for people who may not be familiar that Professor Eric Foner, along with a seminar, and that has been continued on, maybe some of you have been in this, has done and I can't remember exactly the name of the website, but has done a major project on Colombia and slavery, where you can read online about the history of many people who helped form this university, some of whose names are on buildings, and raise the sorts of complex questions that we're talking about as we grapple with our history. So, Professor McCurry.
Well, you guys have raised so many, crucial and kind of intractable problems. Some of them are simpler than others. And I think, to recognize that we live in a country that's saturated in violence, and by the legacy of slavery in the very structures of everyday life, so that when we end up having a violent confrontation over a statue of Robert E. Lee, or over whether the Columbus statue should still stand up there, these are points of incitement, which I don't always regret, because they provoke conversations about this history and about our obligation in the present because of it, that we don't always have. So it's these are not easy things to confront. And I think we don't have a knowledge of the past that allows people to understand or answer these questions about what to do with a statue. People are maybe for the first time understanding when Confederate statues were put up, what purpose they were using. And so these questions that we engage, say, very locally about what should we do with these statues on our campus and so forth, I think these issues have to be confronted, but you have to recognize that this is the tip of the iceberg. And as we frame solutions to those, some of those solutions are just practical. I agree with Professor Harris. I don't think there should be statues to Confederate generals or secessionists in public places. I don't think African American people should have to walk into a courthouse in front of a statue or in a square that's named after somebody who was explicitly opposed to justice for them. And I want to try to tackle this question that came from the back about poor white Southerners and their implication in this Confederate version that purports to be about heritage. Yes, it is a matter of education, and I find this all the time in my classes, that Southern students have never heard a version of Southern history that in any way challenges the notion that slavery was incidental to Southern history, to the Civil War, whatever. So I do think that there are many white Southerners who are grappling with, I taught a MOOC on the history of the slave South, and there are many white Southerners who are grappling with their family histories in ways that are admirable. Not everybody is in denial about what this history is about. And I guess what I really just want to say about this is that these problems are huge. And I think our obligation, my own sense of how we can respond, is that we have to work where we are. I work in the classroom, I work with students, I work in public history projects, other kinds of things. We have to not only take down statues and learn and move them, I think we have to have a different historical landscape. We have to put up things. I'm completely in awe of the work that the Equal Justice Initiative does in putting markers up where slave markets were in the United States, where sites of lynching took place. That is going to change people's understanding of their town, their city, their country. If when you're walking around, you're not just seeing statues to, this white supremacist past and this sort of romanticization of the Confederacy, but at the same time, you have to understand that in relationship to the fact that this was the epicenter of lynching or the Klan or the slave auction and the slave trade. We have to do that historical work too. I'm a historian. That's really my job. Everybody has to work they have to do their own job.
Okay, thanks. Professor Cobb.
I'll address the question that was asked specifically of me, and then I'll dovetail into the question about monuments. To the question about optimism, optimism is the most potent narcotic in America. And what we talk about as optimism here is more aptly described as denial. And we're able to be so optimistic as a nation because we have selective amnesia about what we have actually done in this country. This is 2017. In 2 years, we will recognize the 400th anniversary of the first Africans coming to the United States. Black people have been in this country longer than any other population save for the indigenous population, and are still moored and anchored at the bottom of the society. As a member of this group, I think that history liberates me from the necessity of engaging in the delusion of American optimism. Now, what I am in favor of is a realism that allows for hope, but a realistic hope, saying that the change is possible, but it will exact a great tax from us, that it will require all of our energy and all of our ingenuity and all of our moral conviction to achieve it. And so I'm not a pessimist, but I'm just a very guarded optimist about how these things can be achieved. And so when we look at the salience of tribal hostility in this country, which is reflected after the end of the Civil War in the lynchings, which was reflected in the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which was reflected in the agreement to curtail Japanese immigration in the early 20th century, in the 1924 Immigration Act. This is a very vital and vibrant theme in American society. And that if we are people of conscience who believe that we would see an end to this, we have to be very realistic about what it is we are actually up against. That's one. On the issue of the monuments, if you visit the Red Army Museum in Moscow, you'll see this kind of glorious history of the Russian armies. And it's a magnificent building. And one thing that's notable is that when you get to the part about World War II, they have the materials that were seized from the Reichstag when Berlin fell. And given the horrific casualties, and the fact that 26 million Russians died in the course of World War II, they gathered all these materials from the Reichstag Museum. Now they had kind of conflicting ideas. One, that they had these materials had to be preserved, but two, they could not be afforded any honor. And so when you enter this area around World War II, all of the materials are on the floor, very deliberately. And then you go past World War II, you begin to see these wonderful framings again, and everything is mounted. The monuments should not be removed. They should be toppled, and they should be left there, prostrate, to indicate that at one point, these people had been honored, and at one point, people of conscience said that we can no longer abide honoring these individuals, and we have to afford them a place of dishonor, but it has to be a public place of dishonor, so that we can clearly say that we have broken with this tradition of the past.
Thank you very much. So I want now to invite you to return to the question that I asked you at the beginning of this evening, which is, what kind of conversations will you have as you leave tonight, as you think about your participation in creating this university community and in furthering conversations about the many questions that you have raised and that our colleagues have raised here? I want to invite you to go to the University Life website, both to see if you might be interested in getting involved in various task forces, including our task force on race, ethnicity, and inclusion, which is working as one of its projects to take up some particular campus conversations directly. I want to invite you to join us for other campus conversations on these and related issues. Thank you for coming tonight, and now please join with me in thanking our extraordinary speakers.